They built the academy to break humans, instead one human broke the academy. The Keshvanter Academy had one job. Break you, rebuild you, and stamp Academy approved on whatever crawled out the other side. For 400 years it had never failed. Warlords sent their heirs there to be humbled. Hive mind sent their brightest fragments to be individuated by force. It was, by galactic consensus, the single most effective institution for producing elite operatives the sector had ever known. Then a human named Marcus Delgado enrolled, mostly because his transfer paperwork got mixed up with someone else's, and nobody had the heart to tell him otherwise until it was too late. This is the story of how that went. You have to understand what the Keshvanter Academy actually was before you can appreciate how spectacularly it face-planted. It wasn't a school. Schools teach you things. The academy existed to locate the exact psychological and physical threshold at which a sentient being stops being useful, and then push every cadet past that threshold on purpose, repeatedly, until what remained could survive anything the galaxy had to offer. Provost Yengda, a six-limbed Corvassi with 300 years of service and 0 cadets who'd graduated without at least one full mental collapse on record, liked to say that breaking was the curriculum. Everything else was just decoration. The trials were calibrated with obscene precision. Every species had a known breaking point, logged in centuries of data. Grelkari war beasts could take physical punishment nearly forever but folded instantly under isolation. Zothian hive fragments could survive isolation indefinitely because, well, they were never really alone, but they shattered the moment you made them make a decision without consulting the collective. Everyone had a lever. You just had to find it and pull. The instructors were proud of this system in the specific way that people are proud of things that have never once been questioned. Which is a very fragile kind of pride, as it turns out. Marcus showed up 11 minutes late to orientation, which for most species would have been a court-martial offense and for Marcus was apparently just traffic. He had a backpack instead of standard academy gear, sneakers instead of regulation boots, and he was eating a granola bar in a room full of beings who had, in some cases, killed for less. The other cadets stared. Humanity had a reputation, after all, the wars, the stubbornness, the thing that happened at Chalcedon Station that nobody liked to bring up at dinner. Everyone expected someone terrifying. What they got was a guy who looked like he hadn't slept properly in a decade and didn't seem bothered by it. His roommate, a Zothian hive fragment named Vren, spent the first night in a state of genuine philosophical crisis trying to figure out why Marcus wasn't afraid of anything. Vren asked him directly, because subtlety wasn't really a hive thing. You are aware of what this institution does to people. Marcus, lying on his bunk, didn't even open his eyes. Yeah. Breaks them. I read the brochure. And you are not concerned. I've had worse Mondays. Vren logged this exchange as either profound courage or profound stupidity and decided to reserve judgment. The hive would spend the next several weeks unable to reach consensus on which. The physical endurance trial was designed around a simple premise: every species has a measurable point where the body simply stops obeying orders. Sensors tracked cortisol, muscle failure, neural fatigue. Cadets were pushed under monitored conditions until collapse, then logged, then reset for the next attempt. One by one, the others hit their marks almost exactly where the data predicted. A Grelkari went down at the 90-minute mark, right on schedule, proud of himself for beating his own species' average by 6 seconds. Efficient. Predictable. Beautiful, in the way spreadsheets are beautiful. Then Marcus. The instructors watched their monitors like men watching a pot that refused to boil. 90 minutes came and went. Marcus kept moving, breathing hard, sweating buckets, complaining loudly and creatively about the temperature, but not stopping. 2 hours. The sensors were rechecked twice because someone assumed they were broken. They were not broken. Marcus was just annoyingly, inexplicably still going, at one point pausing to ask an instructor if the trial had a snack break built in, because he'd heard some academies do that. He didn't finish because he was superhuman. He finished because human pain tolerance doesn't come with a tidy shutoff switch the way the Academy's data assumed it would. It comes with grim, joke-cracking stubbornness that refuses, on principle, to give anyone the satisfaction. Provost Yang reviewed the footage 3 times. Somewhere in there, quietly, the first crack appeared in 400 years of institutional confidence. Next came the isolation chamber, the crown jewel of the Academy's psychological arsenal. Total sensory deprivation. No light, no sound, no company. Most species showed measurable psychological distress within a few hours, panic, disorientation, in extreme cases full personality fragmentation. Marcus went in for the standard duration. He came out having invented a game involving counting his own heartbeat in increasingly elaborate patterns, taken what he later described as a genuinely great nap, and composed, out loud to nobody, a full mental grocery list that the recording devices dutifully transcribed for a very confused review board. He is not distressed, one analyst reported, staring at flatline after flatline on the panic metrics. He is bored. There's no protocol for bored. This turned out to be a bigger problem than it sounds. The entire psychological model rested on the assumption that beings shatter under pressure. Humans, it seemed, had evolved a different failure mode entirely, something closer to compartmentalizing the horror and filing it away for later, ideally alongside a nap and a snack. You couldn't break a mind that refused to engage with the breaking in the first place. It was less resilience and more a kind of stubborn, cheerful indifference to the whole exercise, which honestly might have been worse for the Academy's ego. If physical and psychological trials wouldn't crack him, surely the social trial would. This one was subtle, a manufactured political simulation full of planted betrayals, false allies, and manipulative instructors playing roles designed to make cadets crack under interpersonal pressure. It had broken diplomats. It had broken warlords' heirs. It was, by faculty consensus, their most elegant instrument. Marcus sat through the first act of the simulation with the expression of a man watching a rerun he'd already seen twice. "Okay, so," he said, interrupting an NPC mid-monologue, "you're gonna pretend to be my ally, then betray me at the summit because you're actually working for the guy who set this whole thing up, right? And then there's gonna be a fake vote where I'm supposed to choose between 2 bad options, but really the third option nobody mentions is the correct one. That's the twist. That's always the twist." Silence. The simulated NPC, still technically mid-line, did not have contingency dialogue for being read like a paperback novel 3 scenes early. Provost Yang, watching from the observation deck, felt something in her mandibles twitch that in a human would have been called a headache. Marcus wasn't cheating. He wasn't hacking the sim. He'd just spent a lifetime around office politics, reality television, group chats, and family dinners, which turned out to be more comprehensive manipulation training than 4 centuries of galactic academia had ever bothered to develop. He called out the betrayal before it happened, negotiated a version of the impossible ending that the simulation's writers hadn't accounted for, and did it all while eating, once again, a granola bar, because apparently he traveled with an unreasonable supply of them. There was a faculty meeting after that. There is always a faculty meeting after that. He is a statistical anomaly, argued one instructor, a girl Carrie who had personally overseen the physical trial and still hadn't recovered from the ego damage. He is proof our entire model is built on 4 centuries of assumptions that never accounted for this species, argued another, an analyst who had clearly spent too many sleepless nights re-running the isolation chamber footage looking for an error that wasn't there. Provost Yang silenced them both with a gesture and pulled up the old archives. It turned out humanity had, centuries ago, been logged in the Academy's species database as unremarkable, low priority for individualized trial calibration. Someone, once, had looked at humans and decided they weren't worth the extra paperwork. That assumption had just been sitting there quietly for hundreds of years, ossifying into doctrine, right up until one guy with a granola bar and a mixed-up transfer form strolled in and exposed it. The faculty did what every institution does when its assumptions get embarrassed in public: they escalated. If the standard trials wouldn't break him, they'd build one that would. The custom trial was, in the Academy's defense, genuinely nasty. Total isolation stacked on top of extreme physical strain, layered with a fabricated crisis scenario in which Marcus was fed false information suggesting a catastrophic failure back home, a designed emotional gut punch meant to pair despair with exhaustion until something gave. It was, by every metric the Academy had ever used, an unbeatable combination. Marcus sat in the dark, exhausted, fed a fake tragedy meant to hollow him out, and did the single most human thing imaginable. He started making jokes about it. Not because he didn't feel the fear, the sensors clocked plenty of that, thank you very much, but because somewhere in human wiring, humor and horror share an exit door, and he'd apparently decided a long time ago which one he preferred to use. Okay, he muttered into the dark, voice cracking with genuine exhaustion, if this is fake, whoever wrote it needs a raise, because it's very upsetting. If it's real, I would like to formally lodge a complaint with HR. There was no HR. There was, however, a live audio feed, and on the other end of it, Vren, who had spent weeks alternately mocking and quietly admiring his roommate, broke Hive protocol for the first time in recorded memory and requested, then demanded, to be patched into the observation comms. Not to help. Hive fragments weren't allowed to interfere. Just to be heard. You are still speaking, Vren said into the channel, voice flat with the particular bewilderment of a mind that had never encountered this behavior before. Why? Because shutting up, Marcus said, is what they want. And I've decided, on a personal level, to be as inconvenient as possible. That line ended up on a plaque eventually. But that's later. He didn't just survive the trial. That would have been impressive enough to write home about, assuming home believed any of this. What he actually did was worse, from the Academy's perspective. He solved it. Somewhere around hour 6, exhausted, wrung out, still cracking jokes that were getting progressively worse in a way the observation deck found almost more disturbing than if he'd cried, Marcus started treating the crisis scenario less like a punishment to endure and more like a puzzle to pick apart. He noticed the inconsistencies in the fake tragedy's details. He noticed the isolation chamber's environmental cycling had a pattern. He started using the trial's own structure against itself, working out, step by step, out loud, exactly how the test was built and why. By the time the trial ended, he hadn't broken. He'd essentially peer-reviewed the Academy's flagship instrument and found it wanting, live, on the record, while eating what turned out to be his very last granola bar, a moment he treated with more gravity than the fabricated apocalypse. Provost Yengda stood in the observation deck for a long moment after the trial concluded, staring at 400 years of institutional certainty currently lying in pieces on the floor of her professional pride. Rewrite the doctrine, she finally said. Nobody in the room needed to ask which doctrine. They call it the Delgado incident now, in the hushed, slightly embarrassed tone institutions use when referencing the time their entire foundational assumption got dismantled by a guy who showed up late and stayed snarky. The Academy did, eventually, revise its species calibration models. It also, according to several reliable sources, significantly increased its sensor equipment budget, because apparently monitoring a human's actual breaking point requires hardware nobody had previously thought necessary. Marcus graduated. Nobody's entirely sure what grade he got, because the Academy's grading rubric didn't have a category for, technically unbreakable, mildly inconvenient, ate all our granola. He still shows up to alumni ceremonies with a granola bar in hand, mostly, he claims, out of tradition. Vren, for what it's worth, eventually admitted, through several hundred Hive fragments and no small amount of philosophical debate, that watching a human refuse to break hadn't just been baffling. It had been the first genuinely new thing the Hive had learned in 3 centuries. The moral, if the Academy's faculty ever bothered writing one down, would probably read something like this: humans were never built to survive being broken. They were built to be so relentlessly, cheerfully inconvenient that breaking them stopped being worth the paperwork.